I think we're ready. Okay, we're going to start this afternoon, I'm sorry. I've been here for an hour. Here comes the man in the short pants.
Mr. Anderson.
Right.
Ralph Anderson.
That's it. Hello, Ralph. We're going to talk about California, particularly the Bay Area today. See if we can make any sense of a very confused state. We could start big or we can start small. I'll start small and then go back to the big. This state is run by the Burton brothers. There are three of them. They're Irishmen from the Middle West who came to California. Burton, for a very long time, was in the Congress, in the House, representing California. And he got into a terrific battle with the mayor of San Francisco. The mayor in those days was named Alioto, Joe Alioto. And so it was an Irishman and an Italian who was having a standoff. And the thing that hit them worse was that Alioto wanted to make a lot of money, as many people in politics do. And he saw a great chance when the military decided to kiss off the Bay Area. It was a terrible place to work. It seemed to be the most unhappy base for the military. So they closed everything. Suddenly, Mare Island in the North Bay closed. Suddenly, the Presidio, San Francisco, closed. Suddenly, the little place called Fort Devens closed, and then the air base closed. So what we had was a real problem because Alioto saw a chance, particularly on the Presidio and at Fort Mason, to turn them into major developments for housing. And Burton saw it as a chance to build a great park system. And he did. He outfoxed the mayor, and he put together a great base of parks, both sides of the Presidio, that is, both sides of the bay, the Marin side, Marin Headlands, and the San Francisco side. So this left a very big stain on the political horizon because Alioto was furious that he had been outfoxed by the Burton machine. And that type of thing continued to go on in California, which is probably the worst run state in the Union. Let me give you another example. We had a mayor, and we had somebody who was voted out of the Board of Supervisors, and he was unhappy, so he took a gun and went to City Hall and killed the mayor. Typical California politics. And he not only killed the mayor, but then he killed another member of the board, the gay man who was the only gay man on the Board of Supervisors. And so there was a trial. And to show you how unbelievable this state is, his defense was that he had eaten a Twinkie that day, and the Twinkie somehow gyrated him in such a way that he didn't know what he was doing. And this went to the jury, and they found him not guilty in the famous Twinkie defense. Now you remember this is a state that once gave us Governor Warren, who went to the Supreme Court. And when he was on the Supreme Court, he saw to a major piece of legislation almost by the court. The court very seldom will overturn a previous court decision. But there was a previous court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1890, and that upheld the idea that separate but equal was all right. And now suddenly here was the Warren court saying, no, it's not right. and we will overturn it. So you hear this great piece of jurisprudence, and next to it you have this piece of foolishness, the Twinkie defense. And people couldn't believe it. Anywhere you talk to them, they said it couldn't possibly be that this was what was offered as a defense for the murder of a mayor in a city hall. But it was. And so we had to live with this particular. Not only that, then, things can get worse. We had on the Board of Supervisors in those days a woman. Her name was Dianne Feinstein. And because she was next in line by order of when she was elected, she became the mayor of San Francisco, basically without any qualifications at all. And she's remained in politics ever since with no qualifications at all. Dianne is a person, very nice. There's so many people who are so nice and so incompetent, it's unbelievable. She went on to work in the Senate. She's still there, way too old to be. You know, even in the Roman Catholic Church, to which I belong, the Pope has realized that there are too many old fogies as cardinals. So the Pope has now made it an issue that you must retire at 70. Well, we need that as an issue in the Congress of the United States to clean out some of the dead wood. And Dianne certainly would join the dead wood if we could get that type of thing done. So she has remained there, but she had for a while an even more incompetent person serving as senator from the state of California. California for years was controlled by old-line politicians from the Oakland area, Senator Nolan and Senator Knight. And they were famous for one thing. They were the China lobby. They were opposed to any discussion that would bring red China into the discussion. And for a long time, they were very much in the pocket of a young man from Whittier. You don't know who he is. It's Richard Mulhouse Nixon, who did a complete flip later as president and went very big into recognizing red China. But Nolan and Knight did not want to do this, and they blocked any effort on our part to change the relationship in Asia. So we were stuck with these two, and then we have Dai Phi, as she's called, and then we have this other woman. How to describe her? Her name is Barbara Boxer. Some of you might know her. I did a TV show with her once on Channel 4, which is NBC in the old days. And she's a wonderful way of debating. She gets on and gets the microphone and says, I agree with everything Pat said. And now, blah, blah, blah. And she said everything opposite of what I just said. But Barbara had been a terrible politician at the lower level, and so she got to be a terrible politician at the higher level. She used to represent just people on the board over in Marin County. Now, Marin County is probably the most selfish county. They never want to pay anything for what they get. What did they get? Well, there was an air base called Hamilton Air Force Base in Marin, up near Novato. And it, along with all the other things that the Defense Department closed because they were fed up with the entire Bay Area. They felt it was very much an anti-military base for activists against defense issues, and so they closed everything. Now, when they closed Hamilton, Barbara Boxer was around. And progressives, there were 2 or 3 of them in Marin, wanted very much to turn Hamilton Air Base into a civilian airport, which was very much needed. In the South Bay, we have San Jose Airport. In the East Bay, we have Oakland Airport. And in San Francisco, we have San Francisco International. But you go to the North Bay and there's nothing. But Boxer was opposed to it, and she worked day and night, and she got it so that it could not be built on. And do you know where it is today? The runway at Hamilton is 20 feet underwater because they pulled back the dikes and the water rushed in, and there is no air. And God forbid that Marin have any air pollution, any air noise, because they don't want it in their backyard, but it's all right if it's in your backyard. Even with restrictions, you have San Jose, which the typical thing in California is you build an airport somewhere, all away from people. And the first thing people do is move right next to the airport and build their home. And then they complain about the noise. So in San Jose, there are noise restrictions. You can't land or take off after 8 o'clock at night, nor before 8 o'clock in the morning, so that people are not rattled by the sound of jet aircraft coming right down the runway at their house. So that gives you an idea of what the troubles were in California. Failure of the communities to work together. Now we have in the Bay Area an association called ABAG, Association of Bay Area Governments, and they work together to try and get a solution that solves the Bay Area problem. Maybe you don't know this. It's very typical of Berkeley. We've lost 1/3 of San Francisco Bay. 1/3 is gone. Where did it go? Well, in Berkeley, they used to drive to the end of University Boulevard, to the water's edge, and dump their garbage into the bay. So over 1/3 of the bay has disappeared. That's an amazing loss to people who know the value of the bay. And not only was it a loss in one way, we have a major problem. It was called the Gold Rush. The Gold Rush is now an opera. People love it. It's been seen in the movies. But in fact, when the gold was panned, a lot of very deadly items were used to wash out the gold, to include mercury, which does not break down. So now the bottom of the bay, because the water comes rushing down the river systems into the bay, is in fact polluted. And the problem is that every time you dig up, you stir up that pollution again. Well, why would they dig things up? In the old days, if you lived here when I did, and you watched very carefully, the Bay Bridge comes down almost 20 feet when it's loaded with cars, and comes up when it has no cars on it. And in order for the aircraft carriers that used to be coming into the bay to come in, they had to wait until the bridge was up. So you could only come into San Francisco Bay to go over to Oakland, where they were supposed to go, if in fact the bridge was very high. So you saw the aircraft carriers waiting out at sea, out beyond the Golden Gate Bridge, and then they'd come under the Golden Gate Bridge, no problem. Then they turn slightly and get ready for the dash under the Bay Bridge, so they could then turn to their left and dock at Oakland. So over and over, these problems began to bother the area. And it was not just the Bay Area. Let's go, now that we've been at small level, let's talk at a higher level. Once upon a time, in Berlin, there was one of the dumbest Kaisers that ever lived, Kaiser Wilhelm. He had just fired his great minister, who had brought him a peaceful settlement with the Russians and with the French. And now, suddenly, without Bismarck, it looked like war, and war did come. It's called World War I. We weren't in it. We were going to stay out of it. We made a pledge. Our president then was the 8th man from Virginia to be president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson made a decision that he would stay out of war no matter what the cost. So no matter how many submarines sunk, how many ships, how many American lives were lost, we were still not going into war. And he made sure of that by appointing as his Secretary of State, Bryan. Well, the British and the French were very anxious to get us into the war to help fight the Kaiser's forces. Then, as typical of so many German plans, they not only had a dumb Kaiser, a real schmuck of the first order, they had a very, very stupid minister. And he thought it would be a very clever move in order to block America from coming into the war if he sent a telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico to be given to the German foreign minister, to be given to the Mexican foreign minister, I'm sorry. And what did this telegram say? It's the famous Zimmermann telegram. It says, if you will come into the war against the Americans, then what we will do is we will see to it that at the end of the war, you will be awarded back all of the territory you lost at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's the treaty that President Polk signed that took away the entire Southwest to include California. This meant that if that had happened, we would all be sitting here in Piedmont Gardens speaking German to each other, or Mexican Spanish, or something. So, the British snipped the cable without destroying it, read the message, and said, this is a godsend. So they sent it to the White House. And when Wilson saw it, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Wilson went to war. Our Secretary of State, because he was opposed to war under any conditions, he resigned. And you know the outcome of the war. The Americans came into the war, the Germans lost the war. They lost most of their gains they had gotten from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And it was a hard time for the Germans. Right after that, the German government collapsed. There was an uprising in Berlin, led by a German Communist Party. The German army, which had just lost the war, had to go into Berlin and kill the Berliners who were in the Communist Party to put an end to that, and then go down to Weimar in the south of Germany to set up a new government, the Weimar Republic, which is only going to last 20 years anyway. So it was a bad time for everybody, but for the Mexicans, they got nothing out of it. They didn't get the land returned. We hadn't lived up to our promises anyway. In Guadalupe Hidalgo, we said we would keep the land that we got, that is California, New Mexico, Texas, bilingual. There's no bilingual anywhere that I know in California. And if it is, it's by mistake. So that's the big side of the equation that involves the Bay Area, because we're going to be part of that trading deal. We're going to be what was given up. So we can move a little smaller now. You know, if you go up and down the state of California, you can see what used to be here. All the names tell you. San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, San Jose, San Francisco. It was a Spanish-speaking land, tracing its leadership back to, obviously, Roman Catholic saints, which was the thing to do. And when they didn't do that, then they gave the land away in huge land grants. Some of you have flown into LAX, better known as Los Angeles International. When you go out to rent a car or go anywhere to get away from the airport, you're on Sepulveda Boulevard. The Sepulvedas were people. They were a very large Spanish family, and they had been given a very large land grant from the first Spanish and then the Mexican governments. So over and over goes, those things kept twining and twinning and pushing themselves together as people tried to unlock what had been California. Now we have, not only is Di Phi not a great senator, and Barbara Boxer was a terrible one, but we get these unbelievable governors. One of them was an Austrian bodybuilder who just reappeared in the newspapers again. His name is Schwarzenegger. His only claim to fame is that he was once in a movie called Conan the Barbarian. Yet he staged an upheaval in Sacramento, and he got to be elected governor. He threw out a perfectly good governor on an issue of recall, the same thing that's facing Governor Newsom today. Newsom himself is a piece of work. We'll end with the first one before we go to Newsom. Schwarzenegger stayed in office. He was one of several who came from California to be governor. Another one was Ronald Reagan. And another one was Richard Mullhouse Nixon. Not a very good batting average here in states that used to turn out decent politicians. In the case of Newsom, he was appointed to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco by Willie Brown, a very slick operative from Texas, actually. Now, of course, a citizen of San Francisco and a very well-known mayor. Why did he choose Gavin Newsom, who had no experience? Newsom basically owned a restaurant, a very well-known restaurant. Well, he came out and said, I had to have one straight person on the board, which meant there were 9 members of the Board of Supervisors. Now there was one opening, and the other 8 were all gay. So he would have a straight person. What qualifications are those? Better you have 9 gay people if they're competent. The one straight guy who's dumb. Gavin then became a member of the board. I did the news with him a couple of times at Channel 4. He was basically a good-looking guy who had a lot of grease in his hair. You know, that kind of wax you use so that nothing moves on your head, even when it's windy. He also was very famous for a couple of things. He married a woman. You saw her recently on television. She's married to remarried to Donald Trump's son. This awful, mean-spirited woman. When she was on the last time Trump was on, people wondered who that terrible woman was. Well, she's a former Gavin Newsom. Not only that, Gavin is famous for 2 things in the city of San Francisco. He lost the San Francisco 49ers. You know, they used to play in a park very close to San Francisco, which is now gone. And it's gone because he refused to negotiate. His second great achievement was he announced that he had slept with his best friend's wife. Not much of an achievement. And that he was sorry for it, but he had an alcohol problem. That's what caused it. It's the same lousy excuse that Mrs. Clinton used for her husband's scandalous behavior. So now Gavin is married again, and he's facing a recall. Apparently, he will succeed in holding on to the office, but much of the damage is already done. And of all people, Schwarzenegger is back in the press. His life was ruined in part because he went home one weekend and seduced the Mexican maid, and she blew the whistle, and the wife left. What did I tell you? Don't elect Austrian bodybuilders. Conan the Barbarian. The city rocks and rolls with all these things happening to them. They don't get disturbed. Marin has now announced that it's going to have a tremendous water shortage. The last time they had a water shortage, they were so desperate, they asked the East Bay Water District to put down a pipeline across the San Rafael Bridge and pipe water to them. They who were so stingy about being part of anything, they wanted part of our water. Just like Los Angeles wants part of the water that comes from the north, now you have Marin wanting part of the water that's already here in the north. And what topped it off was this dreadful Marin matriarch who had lots of money, who insisted that she fill up her swimming pool, even though we were in the middle of this water shortage. It would have served her right if she'd fallen into the pool and no one had rescued her. And of course, you know that Marin has a wonderful way of saying, well, we don't want to build any more dams, any more retainers. They get a lot of water off, you see it out the window all the time. Mount Tamalpais, the sleeping virgin. There's never been a virgin in Marin in the history of Marin. And Mount Tamalpais does furnish a huge amount of runoff water, but Marin didn't want to build it. Why? Because it will attract newcomers. Well, the newcomers came anyway. So you got more and more people using more and more water and less water to be used. So from Hamilton Air Force Base, which we never ever use because it's now 8 feet underwater, because Barbara Boxer thought it would make too much noise in her neighborhood in Marin. We have 3 airports serving us, but Mariners have to drive all the way across Golden Gate Bridge, all the way through the city of San Francisco to get to the airports closest to them, which is San Francisco International, when they could have had their own airport back in Marin, but chose not to do it. Oh, the problems never go away. California, the Golden State. Not only have we put a lot of poison in the water that was used during the gold rush days, but we now have to dredge because we have to get the ships in. No longer aircraft carriers, because they won't come here any longer. They have nothing to do with us. But you must see those very large ships that come in the Bay Area, they also have to have a dredged area. Most of San Francisco Bay is less than 8 feet deep. There's no tanker, no any kind of ship of any value that can get through if it's going to be 8 feet. So you need to dredge. So that these huge, you see these tanks up in the hills above Berkeley and Richmond, they belong to gas storage. It has to be stored somewhere. It can't stay on the ship forever. And there's an offload area there. It's very small. Ship comes up, they put a thing on the top, and they take the oil and gas and put it into these containers and put it up in storage. So the problem is, how is that ship going to get up as far as Point Richmond? It's going to get there by being on a guideline that is showing where the area has been dredged. So from dredging the bay to filling the bay, you've lost 1/3 of San Francisco Bay since 1850. Now there's no filling at all. In fact, you have to have these huge lawsuits when San Francisco International wants to extend the runways. And the only way you can do it is if you come into court and you can show the judge that you are going to trade, that if you fill in this amount of the bay, that somewhere else in the bay will dredge it out. So if you notice when you fly into the San Francisco Bay Area, there are big salt ponds down in the South Bay near San Jose. Those are now being dredged so that water can go into those areas. So for what you lose up at San Francisco International, you pick up and gain down in San Jose. It's the only way you can make a deal. And then it's a very narrow deal. I don't know if you've ever been coming into San Francisco International when it's foggy, which is often the case. I've landed many times and you can't land there, so they land you down in San Jose, and then they bus you up to San Francisco. So many are these complications that work against you in the Bay Area. And then you just think large again. Have you ever been to Old Town in San Diego? Old Town is a recreation of the Mexican town that was there, down to every little thing. All the pottery that's made there, all the Mexican food that's served there. And it's only Spanish speaking. You know that there are places in Los Angeles where English disappears altogether. One of them is called the Barrio. There are places in San Francisco where English begins to disappear. These large former settlements that were Spanish-speaking have remained at the core of an older group of people who once lived here and dominated the culture. And many of them still do in various different ways. There's a wonderful old movie called The Old Gringo. Stars Gregory Peck and Jane Fonda. It's written by Carlos Fuentes. Carlos Fuentes is a wonderful Mexican writer who comes on both sides of the border. And I've seen him several times when I go down to Guadalajara. Guadalajara is a wonderful university city in the south, in Mexico, the south. And you can be there on occasion when he's there. And you can talk to him. He speaks better English than I do. And you can hear from him his view. And when I tell him, well, you know, in the barrio, Spanish is the language of choice. In the Mission District of San Francisco, it's the language of choice. And he smiles at me and says, soon in California, it will be the language of choice also. We've just sent someone to a higher place in politics, thanks to Mr. Newsom in this case, who is a Spanish-speaking citizen of the state. So what can you say about California and all of its many problems? From movies like The Old Gringo, to cities in the South, or even talk about the museums. We have 2 big museum shows in San Francisco right now. And one of them is the Frida Kahlo show. Frida Kahlo is a wonderful, wonderful artist, and her exhibit is outstanding. And between her and her husband, Diego Rivera, they left a total imprint in the art scene, both in California, and give you an example of where art is often hidden here in California. I took some friends of mine from Marin County, marvelous Marin, to Berkeley. They only want to go there in the daytime. They're afraid to stay at night. So we went up to a women's dorm. It's high in the hills, and it's the only dorm that was. There's 2 dorms. One was all male and one was all women. And in the women's dorm, if you're very lucky, you can find a young co-ed who's going in the dorm and ask her to hold the door for you. Since you don't have a key, you can't get in. And if you're lucky and get in, then there is a Diego Rivera. It was given by a graduate of Berkeley to her dorm. And instead of putting it in the art museum, which is now a beautiful new museum downtown, it's still there in a hallway, a masterpiece hanging by itself, an example of what the work of these great Mexican artists are like. You know, we once had the brilliant mosaic at the Rockefeller Center. Some of you are New Yorkers, you know what Rockefeller Center is. And it was a Diego Rivera, and he had decided to celebrate the worker. Unfortunately, one of the workers was Lenin, the Soviet Lenin. And when the senior Rockefeller heard this, he had it all destroyed. So here was this masterpiece, a gift to all the workers in America, done by a man who was, in fact, a communist himself. And he celebrates all the workers to include this Soviet leader. And so we get it torn down. What art doesn't suffer for ignorance? So you can think big. Once upon a time, the Spanish came here. They didn't start with California, by the way. They landed first in Florida. There's a search there for the fountain of youth. And then when they come, they don't first come to California. They come up from Mexico. Perhaps you don't know the stories of the Mexican conquest by Spain, but the man who carried out that conquest didn't just take Mexico City. He went all the way across Mexico, crossed the Gulf of Cortez, his name is Cortez, and he landed in Baja California. And there's a place there that marks where Cortez was when he crossed the entire North American continent, and then came back again all the way to Mexico City, and then went down to the coast and went back to Spain. So when you know that, and you know something about these people, they left a tremendous imprint, and that imprint is in the Bay Area. Everywhere you turn and look, and all those parts that then became part of something else, the fort that is Mason today is the headquarters of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And it has a wonderful full life-size statue of Phil Burton in the area outside of it's been turned into many things. It's also a location of a youth hostel. All the things that the Burton machine wanted to see done to make it a hospitable place. Young people don't find San Francisco cheap. And they always look for a youth hostel to stay in, just like they do in Europe. And they found one in Fort Mason. And in the larger sense, when they go up to see the beauty that is in the Presidio of San Francisco, the two famous Presidios here in the Bay Area, one down in Monterey, where the Army Language School is located, now called the Defense Language School in Monterey, California. And then the one at the Presidio. And the Presidio has preserved as much as it can. If you go on the Presidio, you will find that all of the old housing has been rented out because the Golden Gate National Recreation Area is the largest, most expensive public park in the nation. It's more expensive to run Golden Gate National Recreation Area than it is to run Yosemite and Yellowstone together. In Yellowstone, what do you have to run? The geyser comes up, the geyser goes down. The wolves run wild, the wolves run wild. But in the Presidio, you have to maintain all these structures, to include the early home of the conquistador himself, which is now the Officers Club at the Presidio San Francisco, and you can rent it out. So if you want to have the next big party that we have here in Piedmont Gardens, we could take a bus and go to the Presidio. And in front of the Presidio, which is in fact the exact example that it was to be, it's been preserved, nothing has been changed, is a huge parade ground. And then on the right-hand side is a huge set of Victorian barracks. And to make some use out of them, they've turned them into the Walt Disney Museum. There is the Walt Disney Museum, of all things, on the Presidio, but it pays rent. And the rent that's paid on the houses that are there, all the houses are preserved, particularly the huge mansions that belong to the generals. They are rented out. So that suddenly now, and this is very carefully watched by a woman named Bechtel, not the other Bechtel, but this is a Berkeley Bechtel, and she watches out because she's the head of the commission that has been given the structure that she is to, with her committee, make sure that all these buildings are rented and therefore they pay their way. Congress does not want to pay for this anymore. And she's been very successful. She took the hospital. It was the Walter Reed Hospital of the West. And she rented it to a filmmaker. And they make films there. Anything to make a dime, anything to pay your way. And so it is that this has worked for them. The Bay Area is very interested in you, for instance. When you cross like I did the last couple of weeks ago to the museum, you cross the Bay Bridge, you're going through a tunnel in the middle of the Bay Bridge. That tunnel, of course, is what used to be called Angel Island. And Angel Island was a Navy base, and it's been closed. So the question is what to do. And so we have turned all of the area that's on the Angel side, that is the island side itself, into rental housing. And the flat area, which was only made flat in the 1910 area when we had a big exposition in San Francisco, and that is now being used as a additional movie studio. It is, they make movies on the flat part and they rent the rental areas on the high part. over and over again to make things actually work, keep the pieces together in such a way that the history will survive, but it will pay its own way. So I don't know what else I can tell you about the nature of the problem. The Bay itself has had all these political problems for some time, and today I guess I'm being a little hard on Dai Phi. She works very, very hard. The problem is she doesn't know how to put a issue together. She's very much in my favor when she sponsors gun control, which definitely needs to be controlled in this country, which is a mad place. You can get guns anywhere. The problem with it is she doesn't carry the bill through. You need people who work in the Senate and who work in the House. Someone like Nancy Pelosi, who's a typical worker bee. You sponsor the bill, you get another person in the other house to sponsor it with you, and then you work the halls and you get people to agree that if you back up my legislation, I'll back up your favorite piece of legislation until you get a majority of people who pass the vote to the point where it is law. And that Feinstein does not do. There is no Feinstein legislation that I know of. And instead, she has recently, in the name of the Bay Area, insulted all the rest of the progressives in the Congress because she thinks it's necessary to say thank you when the Republicans have run something through. And the rest of the progressives say, you don't have to say thank you to them. What they did was wrong, and we're going to overturn it. But it's difficult to convince her of that. So she remains forever. She's a very nice person. She often goes to birthday parties that I go to. There's a friend of mine, John Koba, who's very big in San Francisco Democratic Party circles, and he has a birthday every year, and Dianne Feinstein shows up for the birthday party. But we don't care about the birthday party. We care about the legislation. We have no gun control that's worth talking about in this country, and we desperately need it. And particularly in California, where it's so cheap to get a gun. So what more can I tell you about this funny, funny, funny state? We are doing everything we can do. The salmon, again, are beginning to run. They discovered that there's no water to fill some of these things which are really nothing more than a ditch. So they're taking the salmon by truck. They refuse to be beaten, and they're taking the truck down to the ocean and releasing these fingerlings, these salmon that hope they can find their way out into the ocean, not get eaten by somebody bigger, and come back in a couple of days and make baby salmons and find some place that's not dried up in which they can come back to. It's always an issue, and always in the Bay Area, a big issue. Whether it's that or the fact that we seem not to realize that whales have some priority for some people. We had a whale once come into the Bay Area. I was living here then. Not only did it seem to look around, it didn't leave. And people were going out to stare at it. And the whale went up the bay and went into the river system. And then realized something was very, very wrong, because the river is bringing fresh water down, mixing with salt water, and then turning into completely salt water. And the old whale, he wasn't that old, he was a young whale, he wanted the salt water, so he turned around and came back. We still have the same problems. The whales don't seem to want to come in, but they don't want to get caught up in all these traps that are left along for people who are deep fishing and others who are trying to crab off the shores of San Francisco. Crabbing is a wonderful thing, and it's my favorite thing to eat out of the Bay Area. those Dungeness crabs, but they also have their problems and their problems with us. So we try and work out a compromise. There is a place like to think I can take people someday soon. When you go out across the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge to Marin, then you immediately turn left. You're in what's called the Marin Headlands. Then you come down, and there's this most incredible place. It is a huge series of man-made pools, and in the pools are all these injured animals, mainly seals. Many of them have been shot by Americans who are just anxious to shoot something, again, gun control. And so they are healing them there. They allow you not to look at them for very long, because apparently they quickly get eye contact with you, and then they think you're their mother or their father or somebody. But you're able to walk around, they'll show you, and there's a huge family of people there working to save these injured animals from their injuries in the Bay Area until they're big enough and strong enough to be taken back to the seacoast and let go so they can get wild again, get into the water and leave you behind, living the natural life. It's like Elsa the lion in The Lion Cubs. In this case, it's a seal, many times just a baby seal. But this is a major effort on the part of the Bay Area to preserve what it can preserve, as it tries also to help in many other parts of the Bay Area, down Alto. They have made a very big effort to restore the sea line. The sea area there with the seagrasses are a very important way where the bay meets the shoreline, with a lot of grasses growing, which allows places for small fish and others to basically breed and stay alive. I think I told you already, but it's worth remembering. 80% of the Bay Area is less than 6 feet tall. So when you cross those bridges way down south from here, you'll see people standing in the middle of the water. It looks like a magic trick or something from the Bible, where there are people walking on the water. They're not walking on the water. They're walking on the land that's under the water, which is like 5 feet only of water. Again, that's the reason, again, for all the dredging that goes on, so that the big tankers can come up to Point Richmond, so that the big freighters can offload at the Oakland base. You know, we have the second largest West Coast base for shipping, only outstripped now by, well, actually by two. They've gained on us. One is SeaTac, the Seattle-Tacoma area, which has a huge container port, and the other is Los Angeles, of all places, which is enormous. But ours is still also very, very large. And ours is very lucky because when you have the container ship come in, it comes into a port like Oakland, which is connected right there already with the railroads. So you'll unload a huge number of containers, and they leave that very day for the East Coast. That is, it's easier to bring in products from Japan, from China, from wherever in Asia, bring them to the West Coast, unload them onto freight trains, and then take the freight train and go all the way to the, and in fact now some of the freight trains are taking the load directly to the East Coast, to basic places some of you from New Jersey will know, places like Newark and other sea places that have container ports. and putting them on a container there, and so you can ship from Shanghai to Oakland, then cart them across the country, then load them again on another, and take them all the way to the biggest port in Europe, which is Rotterdam. So items headed for Germany from Shanghai, given that water is the cheapest means of transportation, you can take them all the way there, and this is a very important part of the loop. I've gone many times up to the north of the bay here and seen freight train after freight train loaded with Toyotas, made in Japan, shipped to us, loaded on a train, and then shipped all the way to wherever Toyota wants them to go in the east. So these connective links do make the Bay Area an attractive, money-making effort, even with all the other crazy things that we do, from the famous defense of a man who's basically going to kill two people, and he's only going to use the Twinkie as an excuse for why he was misbehaving, and he gets away with it. The famous Twinkie defense. And I want to tell you that that defense went down very badly. Not only did Diane later get to be the head of the Board of Supervisors because the mayor himself had been killed, but there was a riot. I don't know if you've ever seen the Castro District when it riots. The Castro District is the area in San Francisco which is a very large gay neighborhood. And when the Twinkie decision came down, they stormed out of, and it's only a hand, skip, and a jump to City Hall, and they tried to burn down City Hall. Not a good sign. And we will see what happens then as these things continue to increase. The pressure on the Bay Area is great. The pressure to find living space, to make room for everybody. You know, this country grew by spurts, not by little things. The great man Thomas Jefferson wrote you a document that lives on forever. All men are created equal. He should have said, all humans are created equal. He also gave you his private library. It became the Library of Congress. It is true he also owned slaves, of which he released all of them at his death. And part of his family, which was the Hemings, one part moved into Ohio and grew up and married into white, and they became whiter and whiter. Those who stayed in Virginia married into the black community and remained part of the black people living in the terror of slavery, even though they were free blacks. I don't know if you know that there were a huge number of free blacks. In fact, there were all blacks, some in Virginia who actually owned slaves. So it becomes a problem when you look across these many, many ages of what we did and what we didn't do and what we were trying to do. We had some great men who tried to help. One I'm thinking of is now Franklin Delano Roosevelt and a New Deal, or Harry Truman and a fair deal. These were the Democrats who mattered. Some of the Democrats mattered less. Unfortunately, we've just discovered recently that for some reason, many of the people who came later, who were Democrats, didn't like Carter, mainly because he was, I guess, a born-again Christian from Georgia. The New York Times ran a special on. In fact, it wasn't just the New York Times, it was Maureen Dowd's editorial comment that it indicates there were some bad blood between these people, which is unfortunate because Carter was a very good president and did many good things. But he didn't do them in California. He didn't do them in the East Bay or the West Bay or the South Bay or the North Bay. So we live with what we've got. We have great admiration for a number of people who lived with among us. Well, Carlos Fuentes, the great Mexican novelist, visited us, and we visited him. The great writer of California, of course, is John Steinbeck, who gave us The Grapes of Wrath, the great story of the migration during the Dust Bowl, where family, the Jodes, drive all the way in a broken-down truck from Oklahoma to California to pick oranges. And that's not the only Steinbeck book that matters. He was actually a great California writer. Sometimes they were rather peculiar books. There is one in which all the heroes are ending up being unusual people, but I won't go into that. We'll leave you with The Grapes of Wrath as one of those sterling examples. Or even better than that, Stegner's great book about California and Grass Valley, another part of the state generally not heard from. Stegner taught at Stanford in the writing program there, and that's the Bay Area. And he gave us this wonderful book. And unfortunately, a musician at Berkeley turned the book into the most awful opera you've ever heard. But be that as it was, Angle of Repose is still a fabulous piece of the literature and much to be admired from a man who grew up here in the Bay Area. And last night I was watching and previewing a film for us to watch, and it was the horrible story of the other fascists that came to power in our country. It's in the film he's called Willie Stark. In reality, he was known as I'm trying to think of his name now. His brother was Huey Long, of course. Who else would it be? And the book, All the King's Men, was written by a Berkeley student. So Berkeley has since good pieces of literature turned into very good films. That film is quite wonderful. It's quite long, unfortunately, but it shows you how evil does corrupt. And absolute evil corrupts, absolutely. But I've taken you past your sleeping time, so I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
You have a phenomenal memory for